All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Morey Haber. I'm the Chief Security Advisor here at BeyondTrust, and a simple play on words for this session is, does your organization suffer from an identity crisis? If you answer that question no, thank you for being here. If you answered it yes, thank you for being here. You're going to learn a lot more about what that challenge really is and how to solve it for your particular needs. We're going to do a quick introduction about myself just to know why I'm up here speaking to you. We're going to talk about an identity crisis in depth, why this is an emerging threat that everyone should be aware of, and what challenges we actually face to solve it today. Why it's different. Why is it something new? Why is it something that's been around for a very long time, but today it's become the most important thing for every business to solve for? We're also going to talk about a concept called paths to privilege. This is the concept that every identity and account can elevate its privileges in one way or another, and when in the wrong ways, could lead to exploitation, privileged escalation, ownership of key systems. We'll talk about the top 5 identity risks that plague most organizations, the ones that you need to take back and ask your organization honestly, am I doing these right? Am I doing these correctly? And where can any of those lead to my paths to privilege? And then just one slide on who BeyondTrust is, no product. To start with, my name is Morey Haber, as I've said. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for well over 20 years. My background is in flight simulators and vulnerability management. I'm also an author of 6 cybersecurity books covering cloud attack vectors, asset attack vectors, privileged attack vectors, and a 2nd edition of identity attack vectors. That's interesting. They put a squiggle under A-Press. That's my publisher. These basically are my real-world experiences on how to solve everything from vulnerability management to cloud deployments to privileged access to the modern identity flaws today. Enough about me. I'm here to speak to you about why it is easier today. There we go. For threat actors to log in versus hack in. Consider this concept real simple. You're a nation state, you're an organized crime syndicate, and you want to target and monetize cyber attacks. You can find a vulnerability, you can develop an exploit, you can weaponize it, and it is really only as good in mass until it's patched or remediated. True? So why not train people to socially engineer? Why not people to look on the dark web? Why not train your army of soldiers to figure out ways like QR codes and phishing emails and text to socially engineer their way into your organization to get valid credentials and conduct similar types of attacks? The path to privilege can start with any single individual, any identity and account relationship. And if we look at the simple statistics that 89% of organizations have been impacted by an identity-based attack in the past several years, and new data suggests it's now going up to 90%, we realize that protecting identities, accounts, authentication, and access is now more important than vulnerability patch and configuration. It doesn't mean we can stop doing that, but we have to now look at what the new methods are that we're being penetrated. When you consider that these attack vectors themselves are out there and readily being exploited, and we've moved so much technology to the cloud, we don't even know what's being patched in the cloud. MITRE does not require that CVEs get published by SaaS vendors every time they fix a security issue. We have CVEs so we can patch our own technology, but not for cloud. We assume they're as safe as could be for the state that we're running that multi-tenant environment. And this is why it makes an identity crisis possible, is because the risks that we have today are not just vulnerability patch and configuration. Many of them have been mitigated by going to the cloud, but we have them, or as threat actors go, finding ways to steal a username and password, make a phone call, or do something malicious. How many of you are aware of the YouTube video of the lady crying, calling the phone company? No? Okay, something to Google. Very simple pen test. Lady calls, has got a crying baby synthesized in the background, can't get on the phone, my SIM's not working, and pure empathy and sympathy from the technician, she SIM swaps the phone and gives it to the threat actor. Doesn't provide any information to validate her account, just appears to be completely in distress and socially engineers the technician to basically swap phones. Identity crisis can occur in a lot of different ways, but the key point, I'm going to have fun with this. The key point for every threat actor is that they want to steal your passwords, credentials, your secrets, your sessions. They want ways of coming into the organization because in every piece of our environment, I have to stand over here, I'm sorry. Every piece of our environment, we're using accounts to connect our entire identity fabrics. Think of it this way. We have humans, we're logging into applications. We have MFA, right? We're looking at the perimeters. But everything that plumbs systems together, everything that interconnects them are machine accounts. There's no MFA for that. We trust based on ACLs, certificates, things like that. Any one of those entry points can be an attack vector, machine or human. And we've been focusing lately on how to basically protect the human side by advancing SSO, by advancing MFA, by putting gateway technologies, by using privileged access to make sure that those credentials can't get stolen by the threat actors. But how many of you ask the basic question of, can I log in from my home computer and get email from work? Most people will raise their hand and say yes. We have not taken the trusts that we need down to those systems to protect against human access. Now think of all the plumbing in between for our machine-to-machine systems, all of our business partners, all of our third-party integrations, everything that plumbs Salesforce to Workday to you name it. If any one of them is compromised in terms of a certificate or an API key, the risks can be even higher. That is an identity-based attack. We're going to talk about a real-world case study that I experienced last October a little later on, but you have to think about where every one of those is potentially exposed, could be stolen, or that the secrets used to plumb two pieces of a mission-critical system are not properly stored, inventoried, rotated, managed, all the way down the list. So when you think about, does your organization have an identity crisis, are you doing everything possible on the human side? Are you doing everything in the machine side? And are you doing everything in your third-party integration side? And then we realize we're not doing all three well. And the simple fact comes to what I talked about earlier, the paths to privileges. The top part where it says asset attacks is traditional vulnerability patch and configuration management. This slide comes directly from my last book, Identity Attack Vectors. Actually, all of the books are labeled there, just to give you a little bit of a reference point. And it's something that hopefully everybody has gotten to do well. We scan, we're using a CNAPP solution, we have agents, we're using CrowdStrike Insights, whatever it may be, to find vulnerabilities, and we're using the proper tools to patch them, and we have ultimately a good strategy to protect against, the SASR blasters of 20 years ago. But today, for everything that I've defined, we have identity attack vectors. All of those mistakes. Where is single factor still being used? Can someone run a PowerShell as an admin without MFA? Where are all the places that I'm worried about today that can get into my traditional Lockheed Martin attack chain, cloud or on-premise, laterally move, exfiltrate data, ransomware, blackmail, etc.? How do we think about this today in our own models? We're all IAM professionals. We don't necessarily worry about the asset, but we definitely have to consider identity and cloud as the entry points, and are we securing both equally as well? Now this brings us to a very interesting point. What does the identity attack cycle look like? Now this presentation is actually about an hour and a half long when I go through this in detail. They give me 25 minutes, so I'll do my best here. Let's start with reconnaissance. Does every identity-based attack need reconnaissance? And the answer is no. We see that with phishing all the time. Broad phishing, hey John. My name's not John. Thank you. Good hacker. Didn't even bother to get the name right when they did the mail merge. Hi Morey, this is John from finance. I do have a John in finance. We have a problem with one of these accounts. Can you help me wire the money? Okay, well that sounds legit as a social engineering attack. What if it was deep fake? How many of you are familiar with what happened in Hong Kong? Okay, some nods. Deepfake video technology with a compromised unified communication system of the CEO calling the only person that can do a $25 million wire transfer without additional security controls. And the guy's like, okay, you called me on my legitimate Zoom, Ring, whatever the UCS system was. The guy questions it and goes, this seems kind of fishy. I'm seeing his video and I'm seeing his audio in real time. And when he starts to push back, he gets the CFO and the COO on the call as well. The reconnaissance needed to conduct that attack is mind-boggling. You have to have images and voice of all three leaders. You have to instantiate them into a UCS system with a plugin or something like that. But more importantly, you had to get into the UCS system to begin with to make a phone call that looked like it was the CEO. Pretty bold. The one guy that could do a $25 million wire transfer, a ton of reconnaissance, and it worked. But reconnaissance is not always needed. It's opportunistic, it's phishing, and it does just basically say, I clicked on a link and I stole your credentials. It's a watering hole. It's misdirection. The second is infiltration. What happens next? How deep do they go within your organization? What are their plans? If you think about what's happened recently in the gaming industry last year, their infiltration went right after the hypervisors. And on those hypervisors were tier 1 applications that ran the entire gaming industry locally. And we saw the websites go down. We saw everything from DNS and everything else to go. Why are you putting tier 1 applications on a hypervisor? Well, we don't have a data center anymore. We didn't move it to the cloud, so where else do you put it? Then you have to protect that hypervisor from any based identity attack. Every hypervisor should have unique credentials. They should be rotated. You should be patching them to the top piece. But if not, the infiltration can go all the way through, getting to that point, and then ultimately you lead to the exploitation. What are you stealing? Are you putting ransomware out there? What is the primary goal? The most common one that people think about is basically that ransomware. And you see the ransomware statistics going all the way down, but they don't always have to be so blatant. Think about Stuxnet, even though that's a case study. That was in that system for 3 years plus before the Iranians ever figured it out. When we talk about nation-state exfiltration of data and the exploitation of systems, step 4 and 3 blended, these can go on for years. Some of the attacks that we're seeing coming out from some cellular companies and others, okay? Sorry if you didn't see that, that was a moth flying around. They've occurred for years. And the goal of the threat actor, 1, is that persistent presence and siphoning off that information, or 2, setting up a stage at some point in time where they can hold you hostage. How many of you have seen that basic email? I've installed piece of malware on your system and you've been going to illicit sites and I plan to tell your boss about it unless you send me Bitcoin. I see a couple of smiles. You guys may have seen that before. That's really simple. You're going to go wire Bitcoin and then they hold you hostage. Oh, and by the way, if you don't want me to sell that information, I want more money. And they basically are using your identity in an attack over and over again until they decide to give up. Or you're basically paying mafia-style hit money. What's key here is what we learn. Identity attack vectors really occur because of one simple piece. Humans are the weakest link. We are our own worst enemies. We make mistakes with phishing, vishing, smishing, and we can train our hearts out to solve these problems. But training is failing, and that's because of AI. Straight up, simple, simple, simple. If you craft with ChatGPT an email in any language, it's near perfect. You're not seeing the spelling mistakes by training. Your basic only symptoms are going to be the link and who it was basically from. If you're crafty enough and you've spoofed the domain and used a Cyrillic A versus a proper A, you might even miss that it was the company's name, just one character off, an accent line, etc. And when we look at it on our phone or on a mobile device or a tablet, we may even miss that little extra dot. Training is failing humans today in identity attack vectors. So the best thing that we can do is reinforce the security controls and not be dependent on the human link. We can't go there. We have to find ways to stop the accidental opening, clicking, denial, or, you know what, my company runs the best security tools ever. Nothing's going to happen to me. That's the problem. So we ask ourselves the honest question. Does your organization suffer from or recognize identity security risks. In this room, as identity professionals, we probably all do. The question is how hard is it to get people to adopt it and realize identity security is just as important as identity and access management. You can't screw in identity tools if there's no security built around them, and that's the plumbing end to end. Every place needs to be secured from proper tampering. So let's start with the simple first one. Faults in the joiner, mover, lever process. Doesn't matter if you're using an IGA tool or it's manual. If you have leftover accounts from someone moving, I told you I've been with the organization and in the industry for 20 plus years. Every time I've changed roles, guys, you got to pull me out of that email group. I should not be seeing that anymore. We see it all the time. People tend to accumulate privileges based on their roles and jobs, and we don't do a good job revoking them, pulling them, or verifying certification-wise or attestation-wise that they've been removed. In addition, the dormant accounts. We tend to over-provision people. We give them permissions all the time that they will never use, don't use, and don't track if it's that one-time usage that that threat actor got access to. Now, the second reason is improper use. I go all the way back to Windows 95 and earlier for this. Microsoft literally added security as an afterthought. Truth. They made Windows so easy, anybody could use it. Just hit escape key. It doesn't matter if the login's there, you still get the desktop, right? Anybody here ever work on mainframes? A couple of you fully closed security models, you know exactly what I'm talking about. On a mainframe, when you create an account, you get no privileges, permissions, entitlements, or nothing. You have to add them. Windows and Mac broke that mold and made everything accessible, and now we're still backing into that model of doing it. It is easier to give someone admin rights and just make it work and accept the risk than doing it correctly and say, your account is there, what do you need? Let me turn that on, let me turn this on. And honestly, in today's modern computing world, that's a pain to do. So we over-provision accounts all the time. We also see clients not using MFA, or they've decided to incorporate privileged accounts into a single sign-on solution. Worst idea ever. Worst idea ever. If you take nothing away from this session, don't let people run admin, root, etc. through an SSO solution. Because once you pop the SSO solution, everything downstream is a valid attack vector. The next one is access from end-of-life systems. Anybody ever own an e-machine? All right, we're showing our age. We really are. I love the line, never obsolete. There's no such thing. Any marketing that comes out for any tooling in the security space that says we're future-proof, don't worry about it, we're obsolete, or we have a lifetime guarantee, you all know what that means. It means the lifetime of 5 years, 10 years, or until death of 20 years. End-of-life systems exist everywhere. How many of you successfully have removed Internet Explorer from all of your desktops? Can't. You got that ActiveX control. You have to take special security provisions for anything that's end of life, not getting patches, not resolved, or anything else. If any of you are in the power generation sector here, you could be working with anything to NT351, NT40, and you better have that isolated, segmented, gatewayed, no access to the internet or anything else. End-of-life systems could be anywhere. They're not getting security patches. And from that attack chain model, when you marry identity-based attacks and vulnerabilities and exploits, they are absolutely ripe for complete ownership by a threat actor. That even includes our mobile devices. Unmanaged applications. As a CISO for 5 years, this is my biggest struggle. Biggest. BYOD, one thing. We went from MDM to MAM, fine, no worries. Had to be up to date with patches, easy enough. Insider threats, you only do trusted devices, we get it. Remote workers, we all dealt with that due to COVID. Some better than others. Some of us still have RDP and SSH open on the internet, and we shouldn't. But BYOC is what scares me. Bring your own cloud. That is employees and users using cloud resources the organization knows nothing about and use to compromise us. The case study for this is real simple. Samsung engineers needed a configuration file for a system they never saw before. They asked ChatGPT all of the settings, and it wrote a perfect configuration file that worked on the first try. That information became public, and threat actors used it to penetrate Samsung. You have no idea what your users are using in terms of PowerPoints, ChatGPT, AI, etc. I don't have a solution for that. Outside of web proxying and seeing where people are going, if they're going to use it and put in critical information or personal information about the business, it's a high risk for you. And finally, improper use of business emails. You're using your personal email address in business applications. We started a project in Azure, all of a sudden it became production and no one pulled out that Gmail account. This type of attack, used with privileges or without MFA, is what was responsible for the support breach, company unnamed, last year that I'll go through as a case study. Anytime someone is using a personal email address as a part of a business system, that becomes a valid attack vector by a threat actor to compromise the identity and laterally move from personal to business. And technology problems today are not being solved by SIMs. You have to write all the rules. They're not being solved by endpoint detection systems because that requires an agent. It doesn't cover everything in the middleware that we talked about. And governance solutions are snapshots in time for basically attestation and certification. It does not tell you the runtime of the end user. When we look at it from a model perspective, this is what we have. Our business requirements of any IAM tool we plug in, any of the stakeholders in our organization that have to sign off on it. Every IAM vendor has to have technology partnerships. I challenge anybody to say I have an IAM technology that runs standalone and doesn't integrate with anything. It's part of your house. They have to plumb together. And then all of the tooling, including privileged access management, being the most important because it's protecting the inner circle of privileges. Now, I only have a few minutes left. Let me go through this in detail. And what we want to talk about is what does this look like in the real world. I was asked not to mention the company name. This goes back to circa October of last year. And we're talking about a third-party breach in a support system. Essentially what happened was a session token was stolen. And it allowed the threat actors to gain access to a support system for an unnamed IAM vendor and replay and access an API to perform the commands for every client that that token was stolen from. The vendor's policy was simple enough. If you have a problem with their product, record a HAR file, which contains a session token, and upload it. The threat actors found a way to get all of those files and create their own identity provider, and therefore have access via replay to the sessions. What was interesting about this is when those session tokens were being used, they were being used against the API and not the GUI. For me internally as the CISO at the time, the event basically said unknown, unknown, unknown as JSON with an IP address of Malaysia. A first call to that vendor, they said, don't worry about it, it's a log error. It's not a log error. You're giving me an IP address in Malaysia. Well, you have to have something going on site. No, I do not. I have no indicators of compromise on site. Try again. Start digging and digging and digging with a little bit of a honeypot, with a little bit of other tooling, and we find out that actually the vendor themselves was compromised, and 2 weeks later they came clean on it. The key here is we had an identity-based attack. How did that threat actor get into the support system for this vendor? Very simple. That key that they used to plumb their sales system and support system was stored in the browser of someone's personal Gmail account. They attacked that individual person, finding out who they are with reconnaissance on LinkedIn, compromised their Gmail account, extracted all the keys, and then set up their own identity provider as a supply chain attack to get into all of the clients. Not one indicator of compromise on premise for this identity attack. When we talk about that big model that I talked about earlier, from cloud to end user and everything in between, unless you're monitoring what's happening with external sources, you would have no idea this identity attack occurred. From that vendor, 184 clients compromised, only 3 came clean. In the 2-week time period, no one knows what happened to the other 181. So we have a lot of lessons learned today. Humans are the weakest link. Any identity and account, especially personal and others, can be a path to privilege. Lowest person can have a path to privilege. If they're an insider threat, they have access to one system, and you're not monitoring all of the account usage and the proper instigation, that's where it is. The identity-based attacks are on the rise. The statistics are showing that. Everything that we've been putting together for IAM as an entire house and model is the attack space, is the risk surface. We need to make sure all of the integrations, all of the plumbing are solid and monitor all those tools together. Otherwise, any entry point is possible. And the 5 most popular: fault and join, remove, reliever, improper use of privilege, end-of-life devices, unmanaged applications, and personal attributes at work. That is pure empirical knowledge from what we're seeing in the field. There's probably more, and maybe more will evolve, but that's where we are today. I want to thank you very much for your time. I'll stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions.